Would any of us really, how many kids would we really have if you had to do it, another way? I mean, I think sex is God's way of tricking us into having children. That's what I think. I mean, if you had to order them off of Amazon, how many would you buy? No, seriously, if that was the way you did it, add to cart 1, free shipping if I get 2, I don't know.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
And we're carrying on the series that began a few weeks ago entitled Amazed by Grace. Week 1, we talked about being surprised by grace. And when people received grace, by and large, they were surprised that God would grant them grace in the midst of their situation. Then last week, we looked at the other side of the coin, and then as for every person that was receiving grace, there was someone who was aggrieved by grace. They resented the fact that somebody who didn't deserve grace received grace. And I challenged you, which side are you going to be? Aggrieved by grace or surprised by grace? Well, this week, I want to talk about being empowered by grace. Completely different direction again. See, one of the things I think we have a terribly inadequate understanding of the concept of grace. We think grace is simply this, that it is God's unmerited favor when He just overlooks sin, and that's it. And when we really begin to study grace, you discover there are so many aspects of grace and so many attributes of grace. And I would say this, that grace isn't God overlooking something. Grace is kind of the opposite. Grace is probably the greatest power and dynamic nature of God there is. It's not passive at all, but it is dynamic. Someone gave this illustration. It's only partially helpful, and this is what it was. They said that these things of law and of mercy and grace are like when you get pulled over for speeding. Law is when you get pulled over for speeding and the policeman gives you a ticket. That would be law. Mercy, you get pulled over for speeding and the policeman gives you a warning. Grace, you get pulled over for speeding and the policeman gives you a jelly donut. Now, the problem with that illustration is, of course, it sounds like God rewards bad behavior, which He doesn't do. But what the thing is good in that story is this, is that grace is when God gives us something. I don't know when the last time you were pulled over by the cops. Last time I got pulled over, the policeman looks into the car and says, "Sir, I can't help but notice your eyes are blurry. Have you been drinking?" And I said, "No, I can't help but notice your eyes are glazed. Have you been eating donuts?" You gotta love it when you catch a policeman with a donut in his mouth. Hey, you do know why donut shops never get robbed, don't you? Here's the reason why donut shops never get held up. So let's look at this, and I'm calling this empowered by grace, and my 3 things that I see in this passage are this, that when we're empowered by grace, we're number 1, called by grace, number 2, we're gifted by grace, and number 3, we are sustained by grace. So Paul begins by the fact that he was called by grace. He said, "I, Paul, an apostle by the grace of God." He says that he is called to be an apostle by grace. So he just wasn't saved by grace, he is actually called by grace. But here's what you might not know, that every single one of us is actually called by grace. You say, "Pastor Mark, can you prove that?" Of course I can prove that. 2 Timothy chapter 1, this is what it says, verse 9. It says, "Who has saved us and called us with a holy calling, not according to our works, but according to His own purpose," and say it, grace. So it actually begins by saying you were saved by grace and called to a holy calling. Every single one of you have been called to a holy calling. Now, I know when you read that, some of you are saying, "Well, does that mean I'm called to be holy?" Actually, yes, that would be not a bad interpretation of that. You should try it sometime. But that's not the fullness of it. You see, the holy calling is actually your heavenly calling, your divine calling. And I'm one of these guys that believes that every single person has a heavenly calling, a divine calling, what I call, and you've heard me use this term many times, a greater purpose. To live for a purpose greater than ourselves. And what happens is this: on the road to life, God interrupts us. Wherever we are in life, God interrupts us and He calls us to something. He changes, oftentimes He changes our direction. Think about it. Paul was called. Where was he? On the road to Damascus. And we look into Scripture and we find Peter called when he was going out fishing to go from being a fisher of fish to a fisher of men. And what God does is He invades our life. Let me just sort of illustrate it. We're sort of going through life. Dum da dum, dum da dum, dum da dum. I mean, some people look dumber than this, but you know. And all of a sudden, God invades our life and He captures us for a purpose greater than ourselves. That's the greater purpose. That's the holy calling. And at every person's life, somewhere there should be this moment where God captures you and to leads you into that for which Christ Jesus also laid a hold of you. Philippians chapter 2. Now here's what I've discovered in 30-some years of ministry, is that you don't choose the calling chooses you. Do you think Paul chose to be an apostle? We know he didn't choose that. He was heading in the opposite direction, and God captured him and took him in a new direction. I did not choose to be a pastor. I know you think I'm just sort of making this stuff up. God chose me. Surprise, surprise. Bad choice, but He did. And on the road to life, God chooses us. So when we look at this, we say, okay, so does that mean that God is going to take my life and radically change it and send me to another part of the world? And the answer to that is probably not. More often than not, what God does is not so much change what you're doing and where you're doing it, but He changes your perspective. And you know when you've received your holy calling. You know when you've received the grace of God, because all of a sudden you're doing things differently than you did them before. I'll give you an example from history on that one. In the 11th century, there was a king of Bavaria by the name of Henry III. And he got tired of being a king. Who wouldn't, right? And living in the palace. And seriously, he went to the monastery and he said, this life is not for me. And he says, I want to devote myself to solitude and prayer and the worship of God. I want to be a monk. Now, the head monk, the abbot, whose name was Prior Richard, he said, this is a life of obedience. And you have to do whatever you're asked to do. And I think that will be hard for you because you've been the king. And the king said, I understand. I will be obedient to whatever you tell me to do. So the abbot said this, well, then this is what I'm telling you to do. Return to your throne and serve faithfully as the king and act like you were supposed to in the place in which God has put you. Now, what choice did he do? He said he'd have to be obedient. What choice did he have but to go back to the throne and serve as the king? But everything changed from that moment because he no longer served for himself, but he served the people in which God had placed him over and became one of the greatest kings of Bavaria. And you see how that subtle change, when we encounter God, He may not direct you in a completely different path, but what He will do is He will give you grace to do what you were specifically and uniquely called to do as an individual. There's a story about little Johnny. He goes to his brother's baptism, and after seeing his brother baptized, he cries all the way home in the car. Finally, his dad says, what are you crying about? He said, well, didn't you hear what the priest said? The priest said that we should be brought up in a good Christian home. I don't want to do that. I want to stay here with you guys. And my point in that is that we are to live our lives out for Christ right where we are now. See, let me ask you a question. How many of you think that parenting could be a calling, a divine calling? How many of you think that could be? You should go read the first chapter of the Bible, because it actually says that the first command was to be fruitful and multiply. The first command to man was to be a parent. And the scripture goes on and says that children are heritage of the Lord. They are His reward. It is a calling to be a parent. You do know that, don't you? I mean, when you think about it, I look at it and I think, would any of us really... How many kids would we really have if you had to do it, another way? I mean, I think sex is God's way of tricking us into having children. That's what I think. I mean, if you had to order them off of Amazon, how many would you buy? No, seriously, if that was the way you did it, add to cart 1, free shipping if I get 2, I don't know. And so, I'm not messing with you. The whole sex thing has had a big factor in this, don't you think? There is a reason why the Catholics were having 9 and 10 children. You know what? Well, I think you do know why. Probably don't need to explain that to you. Let me tell you a story about my wife, Kathy, and many of you know Kathy. And when we got married, Kathy was a career woman, and she was always really good at whatever she was doing. In fact, she always made more money than me. Kind of resented that fact. And whatever she did really well. And the whole idea of having children really wasn't on her radar at the beginning. And the reason was she wasn't really interested in babies because she was the baby. She was the last of 6 kids. She'd been brought up as the baby, treated as the baby. Babies like being the baby. They don't want to take care of other babies. They're the baby, for goodness sakes. And so there she was. She had never babysat, never changed a diaper, hadn't been brought up around kids, wasn't really thinking about having babies. But then one day, kind of got her pregnant, And so, not sure how it happened. It just did. And so she got pregnant, and of course, she was a little apprehensive at first. I mean, the whole idea of passing an object out of her body the size of a watermelon, it wasn't sort of really thrilling her, So we were kind of dealing with how we would do with this. They have this thing they were experimenting with of giving birth underwater. Have you ever heard this? If you give birth underwater, it's less stressful for the mother and less stressful for the baby. And we were gonna do that, but then we realized it was going to be very stressful for the other people in the swimming pool. So we passed on that. And so then anyway, our first child was born, and to this apprehensive mother, and she absolutely kicked into gear. And she was just able to do this thing called parenting, and everything else sort of paled in comparison. And everything else, her career and all her other interests and her sports and her husband and everything else got sort of put in the background. And she got so focused on her kids and has been this incredible parent. And now our kids are in their 20s, and she's still parenting them. And she's still their mom. And I've given up on them a long time ago. And she's still at it. And if you were to ask her, if you were to say, Kathy, what has been your greater purpose in life? What has been your divine calling? She would say, my kids. God put me in this world to raise the next generation of young people to go and change their world. That's why I'm here. She would tell you that she was called to be a parent. And see, here's what happens is when God calls you to do something, He gifts you to do it as well. He enables you to do it, which we're going to get to in just a moment. Every one of us has a calling that we need to discover, and it might be so simple and right in front of you, but it will definitely change your perspective as you go along. It's like the story of these 4 men. They were all executives, and they were sitting in the waiting room at a Minneapolis hospital waiting for their children to be born. And the nurse came out and spoke to the first one and said, congratulations, sir, your wife just gave birth to twins. He said, twins? That's amazing. I'm the chairman of the Minnesota Twins Baseball Club. And so they thought that was pretty cool. 5 minutes later, she comes out and says to the second man, congratulations, sir. You're the father of triplets. Triplets, he says. It's uncanny. He says, I'm the chairman of 3M Corporation. 5 minutes later, comes out again, says to the third man, congratulations, sir. Your wife just gave birth to quadruplets. He says, quadruplets? I'm the president of the Four Seasons Hotel. Just then, the fourth man, he collapses and faints. The nurse says, what's wrong with him? They all said, what's wrong with him? He's the chairman of 7-Eleven. So the first way that we're empowered by grace is that we're called by grace. And the second thing is that we're gifted by grace. Anything God calls you to do, He's going to also gift you to do it. Doesn't that make sense? And as you look into Scripture, you find this interesting word for gift. The word that we talked about, the spiritual gifts during 50 Days in the Spirit, and the word for gift there, spiritual gifts, is the word charisma, which comes from the Greek charis, which means grace. Literally, charisma, the gifts of the Spirit, is actually the graces of the Spirit, or the gifts of grace. And anytime God calls you to something, He will actually gift you to do that. Now, I want to show you verse 7 from Ephesians 3, verse 7. It says this, of which I became a minister according to the, say it with me, gift of the grace of God given to me by the effective working of His power. So he says the reason and the way that I'm doing what I'm doing is because God has gifted me to do this. He didn't know how to do it, but he had the gift of grace to do what he was doing. He wasn't naturally able to be an apostle or a minister of the gospel, but God enabled him to do it. And whatever God calls you to, he gifts you to do it. As you look all the way through Scripture, you find it. You find right at the very beginning, you find a guy named Noah. And Noah's asked to build a boat, right? What did he know about building boats? I mean, he lived in the desert, for goodness sakes. And yet, it says, this is what it says. It says, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And God enabled him and empowered him, and he built this boat. Imagine the boat that he built. The boat had to be big enough to hold all the species of animals on the entire planet. It had to have food for all of those animals, and then it had to endure raging seas for not 40 days. They were on the sea for 120 days. How big of a boat was it? Really big is how big it was. How long would it take you to build a boat like that? 1,000,000 years. You wouldn't be able to do it. And if you did, the thing would have sunk in 12 minutes. And you know that's true. But God gifted him to do that. And every time God apprehends a person and calls them into something, he gifts them to do it. Remember Moses? Did Moses want to go into Pharaoh's court? No, he says, I can't do it. I stammer, I stutter, I can't do it. God says, I'm going to be with you because my grace is with you. So whatever we do, God graces us and gifts us to be able to do it. You know, one of the things people ask me all the time is after I've preached on a Sunday morning like this, people will come up oftentimes and say, how do you do that? I say, how do I do what? They say, how do you preach for 35 or 40 minutes without notes, without a teleprompter? How do you do that? To which I say, I don't know. and it's actually the truth. I mean, I don't know. I don't practice. I don't memorize my messages. I actually am surprised every week myself. Every week I walk up here and I think, maybe this week it won't work. Maybe this week it won't happen. I mean, you know, I'm never nervous, but I'm always a little apprehensive because who knows? And I walk up here and out it comes. And I know some of you people saying, well, you know, Pastor Mark, you've probably just always had the gift of the gab and you're probably just one of those guys with those natural abilities. Really? That's what you think? You weren't there for my very first message, were you? If you were, you would know that that's not true. You want to hear the story? Of course you do, and I'm going to tell you whether you want to hear it or not. The church I was in, my pastor preached 70 to 75 minutes every Sunday. Wouldn't that have been wonderful? And every Sunday his message was an hour and a quarter long. And then one day he asked me to preach. I was his associate pastor. And he asked me to preach for the very first time. And I said, do I have to preach 75 minutes? He said, no, 60 minutes will be fine. 60 minutes? I mean, I could talk to you for 60 minutes about mowing the grass, for goodness sakes. I mean, I could talk a mile a minute now. But then 60 minutes, what was I going to do for 60 minutes? So anyway, I went up there. I prepared for like 3 months and went up there and preached. And I managed to pull out a full 60 minutes of message. But in that 60 minutes, I didn't preach 3 points like I usually do. I preached 3 different messages. What other choice did I have? Kathy said to me, why did you preach 3 messages? I said I had to fill the 60 minutes. They were 3 distinct messages that had nothing to do with each other. And I basically preached everything I knew. It was all done. It was my first, going to be my last message because I had nothing left. Everything was out there in 60 minutes. Now, let me tell you how bad it was. Because it was horrible, it was horrendous, it was dreadful. I stuttered and stammered and I made no sense and everybody sat there going like this. Nodding off through the whole message. It was the most painful experience for me and for them. But this is what happened. At the end of the message, they all clapped. You know why they were clapping? Because it was over. That's why they were clapping. They stood and they clapped as if to say, don't ever do that again. It was so horrible. And then I had this woman come up to me and she said, Pastor Mark, I want you to know I'm old enough to remember when Billy Graham first started. I thought she just compared me to Billy Graham. And then she said, you know what? He was no good either when he first started. No, I was just horrible, terrible. I had no gifting and whatsoever, no natural ability for this whatsoever. And the fact that God has enabled me and allowed me to do it is only a testimony to His grace and nothing of my own self. And see, yeah, absolutely. So whatever God calls you to, he will gift you to. And the last and the final thing is that we are sustained by grace. Now here's the really bad news in this whole story, because so far you're going, yeah, called by grace, yeah, gifted by grace, yeah, bring it on. But then what will happen is adversity. Whatever God calls you to is not going to be a cakewalk. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be a bowl of cherries. I'm telling you, there will be adversity, because this is what Jesus said, you will have tribulation in this world. And all who desire to live godly will suffer persecution. And many are the afflictions of the righteous. Would you like me to go on? And you will have a hard time. And one of the things that Paul tells us, again, looking at his writings, called of grace, gifted by grace, but he talks about how we are sustained by grace. And he tells the story of the thorn in the flesh. Do you remember this one? And he tells this story, he said, this is how he puts it. He says, there was a thorn in the flesh given to me, a messenger of Satan sent to buffet me. That sounds nice, doesn't it? Now, we don't really know what it is. And different people have thought different things. You know, there are those modern scholars, they believe that it was some sort of physical ailment or sickness, who knows, maybe. The reformers, oddly enough, in the Reformation, thought that it was a temptation of unbelief. For me, I'm a very simplistic in my approach to the scriptures. I just like to look at the context and say, what was he talking about in the context? And the context here is he was talking about persecution. He was talking about being arrested and beaten and whipped and shipwrecked and stoned. And then he immediately starts talking about the thorn in the flesh. And I look at it and say, it sounds to me like persecution and adversity, but, you know, I'm no Bible scholar. Nevertheless, it doesn't matter what it is, does it? He says that it was a thorn in the flesh. He said that it was something that he didn't want. And 3 times he prayed that God would take it away. Right? 3 times? He prayed, and 3 times God answered the same way and said, no, my grace is sufficient for you. He did not say, my grace is insufficient. He did not say, yes, I'm going to take it away. He said, my grace is sufficient for you. In other words, he said, Paul, I am able to sustain you through this. I'm not taking this away. This is here in your life for a purpose. And I'm not taking away your purpose. But what I will do is I will give you grace to sustain you through this time. Let me close with one final story here that'll wrap this whole thing up. About 10 years ago, I took a group of people from the church, some of you may be in this room, and we went to Mexico. And we went into the Sierra Madre Mountains, which is right in the center of Mexico, and it's very highlands and very, actually quite unpopulated. It was kind of weird when we got there, because the place we were staying in this compound, and everywhere you looked, you didn't see any people, but all you had to do was go into the jungle or go down a road, and there was villages and people everywhere like there is in Mexico. And so the couple that we met up with, their names were Scotty and Phyllis, and they had been there in this barren place in the Sierra Madre Mountains. They'd been there for 20 years. And so they said, tomorrow what we're doing is we're going up to a village, and it's an outlaw village. I said, well, what's an outlaw village? And they said, well, it's in the mountains, up in the mountains, and it's at the very end of the road, and it's where people who are running from the federales, people who are running from the law, they go there and they live there because the federales aren't going to go up there. I thought, sounds exciting. Let's go. And so the next day we went up, and we literally went on this road that wound up the side of a mountain, and we had bridges that were nothing more than logs across the rivers. And we went across these logs, and we got up this mountain, and we got to this place, and the village looked fine to me. I was expecting, gunslingers walking down the street, and it's not what it looked like. And so what we'd done is we brought a bunch of building materials up there to add onto the church that Scotty had built up in this village. And so the very first day we were there, we got the materials unloaded, and then we had this church service. And I was preaching, and a bunch of people came to the service. And after the service, I said to Scotty, I said, it's sort of weird. I said, I didn't see any couples, no married couples sitting together. I saw men, I saw women, I saw children. I didn't see any actual couples. And he says, well, that's because someone has to stay home. I said, what do you mean they have to stay home? He said, I told you this is an outlaw village, and if someone doesn't stay home, the neighbors will break into your house and steal all of your stuff. I said, really? This is the community we're in? He says, yeah. Okay. So we went down the mountain, and then the next day we came back to start building the addition on the church, and guess what? All the materials were stolen. And I'm already mad at these people. I've only been there one day, and I'm already mad at them. I thought they stole, we're building them a church, and they stole the stupid material. What's this all about? So then Scotty knew people, and he managed to get all this stuff back, and we built the addition on the church. And then about the third night, we were having our last meeting there, and I thought, oh, I know what these people need. I know how to fix these people. I'm going to preach to them about loving your neighbor, and I'm going to fix them. And so we had this big meeting, last meeting, and I couldn't wait to get up there and talk to them about Jesus' command to love your neighbor, which means don't steal from them. Couldn't wait to do this. And so the place was packed. There was couples there. I don't know who was guarding the houses. The windows were open. There's no glass or screen, but they were open, and there was men on the outside of the church building listening. Our van was parked right up there, and there was men leaning against the van. And I preached to these people about loving their neighbor and being honest and having integrity, and I just, I changed these people. And I was pretty happy, pretty proud of myself. And so then we were ready to go. We got into our van, and we turned the key, and it started up. We drove 50 feet, and it ran out of gas. While I was preaching and telling them to love their neighbor, they were siphoning the gas out of our van. We couldn't go down the stupid mountain. We had to buy our own gas back from them to get down the mountain. I'd only been there 3 days, and I was thinking to myself, I hate these people. These ungrateful wretches, I hate them. I was thinking, I've been telling them to love their neighbor, and I don't even like them. I hate them. And I'm thinking, Scotty's had grace for these people for 20 years, and I couldn't last 3 days with them, and I was sick of them already. So then we go back to the compound, and every time we went back to the compound, I had this allergic reaction, and I don't even have allergies. And my nose was running, and my eyes were blurry, and I was sneezing. And I said, Scotty, every time I come here, I'm sneezing and running. He says, yeah, there's something in the air here, like this mildew or something. And he says, people with allergies have a hard time here. And then he told us the most painful story I think I've ever heard. And he told us the story about how when they went down there as missionaries, their kids hadn't come. His grown son and his daughter and grandkids hadn't visited them. And after 14 years, they finally talked them into coming. And so they came, they brought their kids, and they weren't there 10 minutes. And their son, who had allergies, had an allergic reaction to this dust. And his asthma flared up, and he was having trouble breathing. He'd only been there 10 minutes. And Scotty pulled him into his van, and he drove down the road 20 minutes to the town of Tula, where there was a clinic. And when he got to the clinic, the doctor wasn't there. And he said to the nurse, I just need an EpiPen. I need an EpiPen right now. My son's having an allergic reaction. And she said, I don't know where it is. I called the doctor, and I don't know where he is. And then what happened was his son died right there, sitting beside him in that clinic. The EpiPen was on the other side of the counter. His life could have been spared, but it wasn't, and his son died right there. So they went back stateside and buried his son, and his wife, their daughter-in-law, was so bitter. She said, I never want to speak to you people again, and you will never see your grandchildren again. And Scotty and Phyllis devoted their life to this place. They lost their son, ultimately lost their daughter-in-law and their grandchildren, which they never saw again for the rest of their life. And when they told this story, there wasn't one hint of bitterness in their voices. And I realized in that moment that they understood the sustaining power of God's grace, that God's grace was sufficient for them. What am I telling you today? I'm telling you that you are called by grace, you will be gifted by grace, and that you will have toughness in life. You will have adversity in life. You will have afflictions in life. I can promise you that. That's just the way life goes. But the good news is that God will sustain you by His grace. You are called by grace, gifted by grace, and you are sustained by grace. And let me end with this. God's grace is sufficient for you.
Church of the Rock has services every Sunday at 1397 Buffalo Place, and we invite you to join us when you're in the Winnipeg area. If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. Visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.